Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader, and we have another great guest today. And for such episodes, always add a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against any particular party, ideology, or group, but that's really never a problem here. And episodes are for anybody of any political persuasion. So political discussions are often filled with toxic rhetoric and behavior. People are too often attacked verbally or even physically for their opinions, and such toxicity has led to some high-profile instances of political violence, especially in recent years. And we can combat all this with more civil discussions. But what exactly is civility? Toxicity is easy to spot, but what actually constitutes civil and effective dialogue is sometimes misunderstood, and it's critical to truly understand civility to counteract polarization. So how do we become more civil? Well, that's what today's guest, Dr. Michael Lee, is here to discuss. Dr. Lee is the executive director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston, which promotes dialogue across differences, as well as hosts panels and workshops about communal engagement and healthy discussion. He is also a professor at the college, the host of the When We Disagree podcast, and an author of multiple books. Dr. Lee also earned a PhD in speech communication and rhetoric from the University of Minnesota. So let's get his insights on the meaning of civility and how to effectively push back against toxicity. Please welcome Dr. Michael Lee to the show. Dr. Lee, thanks for coming on. How are you?
This is a real honor, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, honor's all mine. So always like to go back to the beginning for my guests. Before all this work with the Civility Initiative, what got you involved in work on promoting civility and combating toxicity in general?
I was practicing it, honestly, because I come from a debate background. And so I was not a very good high school student, and I was looking for an easy A. And a friend of mine said that this debate class at shout out to East Mecklenburg High School in Charlotte, North Carolina, that this debate class was pretty easy. I should take that. I was maybe a junior in high school. I got into it. I really loved it. I went to a debate camp for super nerds, and then was lucky enough to get a scholarship and keep debating in college. And then I coached debate for a few years after college. And then, so I wasn't really thinking about it as promoting civility. I was just thinking about it as a fun activity that was obviously highly argumentative, very research-based. And then when I left the activity and got a PhD and was researching political theory and writing books on conservatism or secession or whatever was floating my boat at the moment, I kept coming back to debate. I kept coming back to the importance of people debating ideas in a democracy, skills it takes to debate, not just expecting good debates, but structuring good debates. And so I realized that debate itself was an act of civility, which I just mean as an act of engagement. To really debate you, I have to some extent take your argument and your point of view very seriously. I have to give you some charity about the idea that you've researched that argument. I have to share a space with you. I have to engage in turn taking, letting you speak, listening to what you say. And so I think debate, it can be very connective. Debate can be very dialogic. Debate can be very civil. My favorite definition of it, which I'll steal, Teresa Bejan, Mere Civility, talks about civility as not trying to land all your punches at the same time, but also not necessarily pulling your punches either. And mere civility just means it's in some cases beneath politeness. Let's just try to be civil to one another. And so the question is, how are we engaging? And I think that debate done really well can actually be a really great act of giving respect to one another, sharing space with one another in a democracy, and civility.
I like that definition. I'll have to keep that in mind. Yeah, it is funny how, when you take a certain path, you sometimes never know what it's going to lead to, right? You talked about just how much you didn't actually mean to get on this whole debate path. It was just something fun for you. And then look how well it turned out. Definitely. Yeah. So go ahead.
With that point, I'm reminded of the long debate about Robert Frost's Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood. And we like to think that poem is about looking back and saying, I made the right choice and look how my life has turned out. But in fact, at least his intention was to write a book about how we delude ourselves, that many of our choices are completely accidental. And we look back at our lives and say, oh, I really made the right call in all these different ways. And look how good I am and how my life has gone so well because I really made myself suffer and took the road less traveled. When in fact, when you read the text of it, both roads are the same, and it's just kind of an accident. It is just I was a lazy high school student. I got into a class that I thought would be an easy class, and that has made all the difference, as Frost would say.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. Well, now let's talk about the Civility Initiative. So, how did this initiative at the College of Charleston start? How did you become involved with it? And talk about more about what it does? I know I gave a little bit of an idea of what it is, but I want to hear it more in your own words.
Yeah, the Civility Initiative, by my direction, is interested in dialogue and debate. So we promote healthy dialogue across our differences, and we promote debate skills amongst the students, faculty, staff, and then the wider public here around Charleston. And to that end, to both of those ends, at least debate and dialogue, we do movie screenings, book talks, panels, debates, workshops, communication skills trainings, you name it, around those two goals. And so, in addition to our event programming, we have obviously the media arm. I host a podcast, When We Disagree, which is about powerful disagreements that have shaped people's lives one story at a time, in over 115 or so episodes now, and 2.5 seasons. We have had every kind of disagreement you can imagine, which is from mom to MAGA and dad to the Denver airport, and conspiracies about that. So it's been amazing to cover so many different ordinary people's memories of and relationships to conflict in their lives. And then on campus, we do skills training, because it's one thing for you and I to create one episode about the importance of listening or the importance of depolarization. It's one thing for me to get a writer or a speaker to come talk about their book on the subject. But those are ephemeral. They can be inspirational, but they're also ephemeral in the sense that if you miss this episode, you miss it. And then even if you heard it, maybe you got more interested in the subject, but did you get any better at the practice of it? So many of the things that we're talking about today are skills. They're dispositions, but they're also skills. And you and I could have a hour-long conversation about dribbling a basketball, and maybe people would be more interested in dribbling a basketball, but would they be any better at it? Probably not. And so we need to structure, and what we've been structuring at Civility Initiative is year-long trainings for select students. Our free expression fellows do debate dialogue training, and then they do debate and dialogue peer-to-peer programming, tabling events and bigger events with speakers and invited guests and so forth, with staff to integrate debate and dialogue into the co-curriculum. And so we do a training for a year on that. And then we do a training for a year with faculty on how to construct assignments based on debate and dialogue. In other words, to increase the skill, the disposition, and then our bandwidth for conflict to tamp down our fight and flight responses.
That's such an important point you make about the development of skills. And that's why I try to not just have, yes, I like talking about the stuff and teaching people these things and all that, but if they don't have any actual practical application of it, then how impactful is it really? That's why I always try to have as much practical information that people can act upon as well. So I can definitely appreciate that. And I think also with people listening to politics in general, they just see that people just have if they're not in it, it feels like they don't necessarily feel like there's a practical way they can get involved. They feel like it's too inaccessible, I guess. And I think stuff like this is a really great way to show people how it does not have to be inaccessible. There is a way that you can actually practice this, and it doesn't have to be anything super like, oh, you have to get ingrained in politics to do this. No, there's other ways that you can go about it as well without completely dedicating your life to it like we do. And and speaking of which, when I was looking at the website, I saw this really interesting point that you guys for the Civility Initiative make about how the initiative works in two different areas to promote civility, and it's fight and flight. And fight includes aspects like polarization and bigotry. Flight includes aspects like withdrawal and echo chambers. So can you tell us more about what this fight versus flight dichotomy is about, why the initiative makes those distinctions, and why those differences are so important?
Yeah, thank you for that. And that distinction is really meaningful for me. I know this is the Politics with Paul podcast, and I love the alliteration there. But I also when I talk about our work at the Civility Initiative and my work in general, I try to say that it's not just political. In fact, most people think when I talk about civility that I am talking about red states and blue states, or arguments about the presidency, or arguments about foreign policy and so forth. And I think it's just as much an organizational issue, a relational issue, a media issue, a theological issue, and you name it, as it is a political issue. So most of the time, I'm actually just trying to say we need to think about this beyond politics, because we need to think about our personal relationships to conflict within ourselves. To what extent can I sit with a messy idea in a debate with myself about how I feel about something or what's true, or do I need to make a final decision as quickly as possible because that brings up so much cognitive dissonance or just feelings of distress that I can't handle it? And then how do I feel about conflict with you or anybody else? Can I find any curiosity in it? Can I find any joy in it? Can I find any relational connection in sometimes really necessary conflicts, or even joyful conflicts? And so, to that end, I say, we're not doing political work, we're not doing media ecosystem work, we're not doing free expression, First Amendment work. We are doing nervous system work. And we are doing nervous system work in the way that I relate to conflict within myself and the way that I relate to conflict with you. And my pet theory is that, of course, we all have nervous systems, but I think relationships have nervous systems, and I think organizations have nervous systems, and maybe even nations have nervous systems, which is the extent to which they can tolerate stress before they become dysregulated. So what is the extent to which I can tolerate it, you can tolerate it, but also our relationship can tolerate it, my campus can tolerate it, my state, and then on out from there. And so if we're doing nervous system work, then we are improving our responses to the potentially dysregulating functions of fight and flight. So can I acknowledge fight instincts that come up with me as I relate to conflict, and then move past those, acknowledge them, move past them, move through them, and then still engage? Or flight issues. So most of the time, I think when we think about problems with incivility in the United States, we have a negativity bias. That makes sense. You mentioned violence at the top. And those are fight issues to me: cancellation, bigotry, violence, and so forth. And more often than not, in my experience, the real enemy to connection, the real barrier to connection, is silence, is not violence. It is our fear of violence, our fear of getting canceled, our fear of, as one student said to me, becoming known as that kid who said that thing, which is to say a fear of stigma or a fear of excommunication. But most of the time, the chilling effect caused by that negativity bias and our fear of fight creates flight instincts. And those to me work in a kind of infinite, mutually reinforcing loop cycle where the more we fight, the easier it is to flee from one another. And the more we flee, the easier it is to demonize each other and therefore fight.
And I think you see that so often in politics, where people just eschew it just because they just don't want to deal with other people. And then when you don't interact with other people, you don't really actually get to see what they think. And then, of course, some people just want to sit out of politics completely because they don't want to get involved in it. And then that helps,
Right.
unfortunately, this incivility fester. But the point you made about this not just being a political issue is so important too. Obviously, yes, like you said, this is a politics-based podcast, but this really is something that can be applied to all facets of life. And when I think when you put it that way, people who are naturally averse to politics, they'll at least be a lot more open to it when you're saying, oh no, this is for all your relationships, or if you're into religion or anything else. It's information that can help anybody in whatever strife they're having with another person. So I can definitely appreciate that. I know I look at it through the lens of it being politics based just because of my work, but it is definitely something to think about in all aspects of life. And something else I've talked about before is that I think a lot of people misunderstand what civility actually is. They might think it's, we just talked about it now. It might simply not be pushing back on people or never getting upset. So do you see a lot of this misunderstanding about what civility actually is? And what do you think are 2 to 3 of the most common misconceptions about the meaning of civility or how to employ it ourselves?
It's a good question. I would say the most common that I face are that it's politeness, that civility is etiquette, that civility is exclusively political. So it's only relevant when we talk about politics, and especially only relevant when we only talk about politics with Paul. And then that civility is, in some sense, people telling each other to be more civilized, is an argument that I run into. But I would say most of the time, of course, I direct the Civility Initiative and I'm interested in the broader cause. But the two words that I use the most often are debate and dialogue. And I like to filter those down into better decision making. So how can we improve our dialogue skills? Meaning listening, meaning letting go of winning, meaning humanizing connection and humanizing disagreement, meaning perspective taking and seeing the world through your eyes as best I can. And then debate, which is also perspective taking, but also comparisons of evidence and crystallizing arguments and making conclusions about complicated issues. And so, and how those filter down into better decision making for people, for organizations, for political parties, you name it. So that is where the rubber really hits the road. Is, of course, we can talk at a high level about civility, what is it? But when we start talking about skill building, I think we're really talking about skill building around those two things, debate and dialogue, and then making situational judgments about where one or the other is necessary and how that can improve our decision making. So do we want the most people involved in the decision? Do we want the most relevant information? Do we want most buy-in from key stakeholders who stay loyal to the decision-making process of the group, even if they don't get their way? And can we make the decisions that we think best reflects what the evidence tells us? I mean, that to me is what the best decision-making looks like. Sometimes that requires us to figure out what's true and what's false, or what's probably true given our limited evidence and what's probably not true. That's a debate skill. Sometimes we need to just humanize disagreement and say, I understand where you're coming from. Don't agree with it, but I completely get how you got from point A to point B. And that's a full stop. That's a complete sentence. And that's a dialogue skill. So civility is one thing, but then when we talk about the work of skill building, we start talking about debate and dialogue.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately some people that on that last point, they still see that as like a tacit endorsement of like, so you're not going to fight them. You're just going to say, oh,
Right.
I disagree with it, or I see your point, but I disagree. Then, some people think, oh, you're still giving them too much ground. Something I've
That's right.
looked into a lot is this, those moralized attitudes, and I'm trying to figure out how to break through those moralized attitudes, because people think it's a moral imperative to not budge an inch because you figured everything out. And it's, for some of those people, I imagine it's a bit harder to teach those debate skills. And I think another thing, civility, that I see a lot of times is people think it means you can't ever be angry, which I mean, I think is just, it's not reasonable to expect human beings to never be angry. It's more about how you channel that anger properly. You can still be, be angry about something you think is wrong, but you can still try to talk to people and try to be, at least see where they're coming from. It doesn't have to preclude you from doing that. Now, if you're going to tear their head off, then of course that nothing good is going to come out of it. But I think some people try to also, I think that's kind of why people, escape from it. That flight response you talk about is just because they think I can't ever be angry about something, so I'm just going to be angry over here. That's not what it means. But you have to channel that anger properly, which I think a lot of people don't do, and myself included. I'm not going to pretend like I've done it correctly all the time either. But another big thing I try to emphasize is that everybody is capable of contributing to polarization, including myself. But a lot of times it's unintentional in a lot of people's cases. But what do you think are 2 to 3 things people think are civil, but in reality actually contribute to toxicity in political discourse? I know we kind of touched on it earlier, but let's dive into it a little bit more.
That's a really good question. To what extent are people mistaken about the things that they do that they think are civil, but in fact are not?
Yeah.
The two that come up for me are, I think that lots of time, I mean, because most of the time, as I mentioned earlier, I'm focused on the extent to which people are not engaging as opposed to people are over engaging. In other words, I'm worried about avoidance rather than antagonism most of the time. And I think that a lot of times people tell themselves that avoidance is the way to stay civil. And avoidance preserves a thin connection at the expense of a thicker connection. That if we just avoid the hard topics, then we can live the fight another day. And sometimes that is true, absolutely. And sometimes we have to look at what we want out of this relationship. Like, do I want a deeper political relationship with my uncle at the stereotypical Thanksgiving dinner, and so I have to talk about the most sensitive issue? No. But a lot of times, even in our closest personal relationships, in our marriages and on our campuses and in our organizations, we avoid the issue. We don't talk about the issue at hand because we're worried about giving offense. We're worried about the consequences of giving offense and so forth. So I do think avoidance is something that we do to do that. And the second thing I think that we do is we talk a lot about authenticity. And I think it's really important for people to show up to discussions and not be provocateurs who are deluding themselves into thinking that they're going to have a million followers and because they've owned somebody in a kind of like online stream or something. So I do think it's important to speak your heart and approach things as you really feel as opposed to playing some character for an imagined audience. But I also think it's important to not just reinforce who you and I are as stable forever entities as we've entered this conversation and really open ourselves up to the vulnerability that it takes to encounter another person and the vulnerability that it takes to say, I don't know everything, and perhaps you know information that could shift my perspective. And so the extent to which we need to really do perspective taking is limited by a kind of cult of authenticity in which I am always and forever my one true self. And I think that sometimes we think about that as a civil move. And I do think there's, like I said, with anger and others, there's a real role for that, there's real power in that. But we can also overdo it and limit the extent to which we can do perspective taking because we don't want to, as you said earlier, give attention as opposed to affirmation. We don't want to have a conversation that makes us complicit. And then those two that I talked about, the attention and conversational avoidance, kind of work hand in hand.
Yeah, that is a good point to make about the avoidance, is that sometimes you don't actually have to get into something. That is true. Some people think that, as soon as something political comes up, they have to get involved in it and they have to have some sort of debate, usually taken a little too far. But I think every one of us has those situations where we have a family member or whatever that gets a little too wound up about something, and we just kind of say, you know what, I'm just not going to deal with that, and that sometimes is fine. But when you carry it into every single potential conversation where you just don't want to deal with it, that becomes a problem. And I appreciate that point about authenticity, because it is good to be authentic. You don't want to be lying about the kind of person that you actually are. But at the same time, some people take that to a point where they just really like play up who they are. And sometimes it's okay to temper things a little bit. You can, you just because you're, talking something out doesn't mean you're not being authentic. And I do think there is a little bit of an overemphasis, like you said, on being authentic, or at least the way that they think they're being authentic is, I think, not necessarily. Ironically, I think some people thinking the way that they're being authentic is not necessarily actually as authentic as they think. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of something that I'm just thinking about now because of that point that you made. But of course, we've all encountered toxicity in our lives, whether it's from somebody else or maybe we contributed to ourselves. But from your personal experience, what are 2 to 3 personal examples from your life where you use civility to push back against toxicity, and what were the results of that? So people, in case they have similar situations to you, they might be able to say, oh, okay, maybe Dr. Lee handled it this way. What were some examples of that?
Gosh, again, I'll go back to kind of my hobby horse, which is that I think that when we think about how we engage one another, and when we talked about the possibilities of relating to one another as people and as citizens, we kind of have 3 choices and how we deal with difference. And one is silence, and one is violence on the other end of the scale, or some sort of elimination or separation. And in the middle, we have all sorts of kinds of engagement that can look lots of different ways. And antagonism, negativity bias, the fight issues get a lot of publicity, and I don't need to relitigate those. But the silence issues, the more insidious issues of flight, are the ones that I also see as toxic. Those are the ones that I also see as uncivil or incivil. Those are also the hardest ones to measure. It's easy to measure when people are screaming at each other, but it's hard to measure when people don't talk because they fear getting screamed at. And so the numbers of times, because we do trainings for the community at libraries and so forth. We do trainings for county and local government and corporations. We do trainings for faculty, staff, and students around how to engage one another. in terms of creating fun, easy on ramps to get our conversations flowing, in terms of having accessible topics that people have a personal stake in, so they're interesting and fun to talk about. And three, it's to make it fun. It has to be enjoyable. So, what are the structures and turn takings that we can do to make it fun, to make it seem like there's some cash value to it? Like, I'm going to get something out of this, like better decision making, or being better at debate, or better at dialogue, or better listener. There's some sort of cash value, some sort of action item. Though we've done so many of those, and those would all be examples that I would point to say, this is a place where the work of civility can really help people's lives get better in the moment. But all of those examples are about getting people to talk, not getting people to stop screaming.
I like that point about making it fun and engaging, because I think a lot of times people find debates and that kind of thing, and especially in the realm of politics, I think a lot of people find it boring or just not any sort of interesting to them. And I think that's unfortunate, because it really can be a very fascinating experience for you to actually engage in that and have some sort of, I personally think it's fun to find new ways of how people think about something. I'm not necessarily, supporting what they think or not, but
Right.
at least I find it more fascinating and engaging to try to at least figure out why somebody thinks the way they do. Whether it's for me to think about, okay, well, if I'm going to debate this later, how do people think about this? How can I counteract it? Or maybe they'll say something that I find convincing and I'll be like, oh, you know what? Never thought about it like that. Maybe there is something to that. But I personally find it interesting in that angle. Maybe partly there are some people that just don't have a natural curiosity in finding why people think the way they do. And that's probably a whole other topic to get into. But I think that's also a really good point to make about, people aren't going to get involved if they don't find it engaging in some way. And it's not necessarily because they don't want to get involved in arguments or anything like that. They just don't think it's interesting in any sort of way for them, which I think is a shame. And I think I really appreciate that the Civility Initiative takes that into account. And so, going more back on the actual toxicity and division that we have right now, there's a lot of things that are contributing to our toxicity and polarization and division of today. For you, what are the 2 to 3 factors in particular that heavily influence toxicity in political discourse and thus make civility more challenging?
Inattention to one another is a big one. I think that, as I mentioned, the more we fight, the easier it is for us to flee, and the further away we are from one another. I'm far from the first person to say that. The easier it is for us to develop misconceptions around one another. I do think that plays into. I'm one of these people who thinks that we as humans, and this is a big claim, so go with me for a second. I think we have kind of a dual nature in a way. I think that we can be deeply connective, and I think we can be deeply combative. And that's a really confusing thing to say, but the minimum thresholds under which we can create group identity, by which we can tribalize, by which we can form in groups and out groups and cliques, is nearly infinite. And it doesn't really take a big deal for us to tribalize over. And of course, if it is a big deal, if there's a lot of identity or money or life or treasure on the line, then it can be very tribalizing. But also, we can be deeply connective and empathetic, both within our groups and beyond our groups, hopefully, as the circle of morality and who matters really expands for many of us. And so, places where the political scientist or political psychologist Liliana Mason talks about cross-cutting cleavages, these places where our identities just don't quite line up, you know, Democrats who own guns, for instance, or something along those lines. These places where we think we live in these perfectly siloed spaces where my TV shows, my consumer choices, the car I drive, the zip code I live in, the neighborhood I live in, the place I work, and of course my politics and my political identity, all those things are perfectly in unison with one another. Finding cross-cutting cleavages within people, places where my identity is just contradictory or screwy, and then places between us where we're connecting across those kinds of lines of assumed division, I think is a real antidote. because it promotes not just that kind of connection and humanization, but hopefully in the end, what I'm really working on is the ability to do perspective taking. So anything that we're not doing that is encouraging perspective taking, encouraging exposure, encouraging connection across difference, to me is a place where we can be at real risk.
I very much agree with the point about us being human beings being very contradictory. In fact, I think that's one of the most human things about us is how contradictory we can be. I mean, no, I don't think anybody is ever 100% in line with what they believe. And
Right.
put another way, human beings can be incredibly creative and incredibly destructive. And sometimes it's the same person. Or you look back at, U.S. history, and I think this can sometimes be a very touchy subject, but you look at the founding fathers, and there's so many amazing things they did, and what they built, and how long it's sustained. But also, a lot of them were slave owners, and that also has to be acknowledged. There's a creative side to them. There's a destructive side to them. And yes, you can say, "Oh, well, it's the time frame they came from." Doesn't mean that it's justified. You understand that it's a different time frame, but like George Washington, for example, talking about, or Thomas Jefferson saying all men are created equal, but they still had slaves. But doesn't discount that a lot of the great things they did, but you also have to acknowledge a lot of the more destructive aspects of them, even though there was that little bit of that cognitive dissonance. And the point about you made about the cleavages, I think is so important, because we do have a tendency to mistake groups for individuals, and groups being, when we see a group, we obviously have a specific idea of what they are, and a lot of times that's it makes sense. But then you'll find somebody in that group that just happens to step out of that line, and I sometimes really want to know more why they do, what exactly makes them do that. But you'll like you said, you'll find Democrats that are pro-life, you'll find Republicans that are pro-gun control. It's we have to be careful that we don't make this assumption that, oh, just because they have this one label, that means that they're obviously this way, because you're mistaking the groups for the individuals. And now some people get into that group think mindset where, like, or the really hardcore partisans talk about rhinos and dinos, Republicans in name only, Democrats in name only, because they get upset that they're stepping out of that line. But the parties are by definition a coalition, so there's going to be some tug and pull. There's going to be some conflicting identities in there. So I really appreciate you highlighting those points as well. And so we're coming up a little bit towards the end of here, but I want to give you a chance to real quick promote your own podcast, since obviously it's very relevant to the discussion we're talking about. So you have your own podcast called When We Disagree. So can you tell us more about the podcast? I know you talked about it a little bit earlier, but tell us a little bit more about the podcast, why you started making it, and is it a component of the Civility Initiative, or is it your own thing?
Yeah, the Civility Initiative, I think about having three audiences. One is, how are we influencing our national conversation about collective, peaceful, democratic coexistence? How are we influencing our state and our region in promoting effective decision making at all levels? And then, of course, the college campus at the College of Charleston, where I love to work. And so those are three audiences. And so, to what extent we can talk about and reach a nation or find an audience that is not in my zip code or in my state, that is through appearances like this, media work, but also the podcast. And so the podcast is very much a part of the Civility Initiative. The podcast is When We Disagree, is the shower idea that has taken over my life, and I adore it. And I started almost 2 years ago. We're about at the 2-year anniversary this March of 2024, and we've had, like I mentioned, over 100 episodes. And the premise of the show is simple, which is, what's a disagreement you can't get out of your head? And I try to get people who are thoughtful about conflict, or thoughtful at least about one conflict, if not lots of conflicts in their lives. And so sometimes we'll have authors talk about a conflict related to a book they wrote, but sometimes we have people who have nothing to promote, and they just want to talk about a conflict they had with their mom, or a conflict they had about how to restore a piece of land near their house, or a conflict they had with their mechanic about repairs to their car. but these are meaningful conflicts in people's lives that they can recall very, very well. And most of the time, it's about our internal emotional connection to conflict and trying to get a little bit better at that. And sometimes it is relational. So the story I told in the first episode, and the reason I created the show in part, was that I have this really powerful memory of being in an airport 15 years ago, and I needed to change my flight. And the agent who was working at the desk that day made a mistake and canceled my flight as he was trying to change it. And it was early in the morning, and I didn't have my coffee and all the other excuses. And he said that he had accidentally canceled the flight relatively flippantly, or at least I heard him say it flippantly. And I didn't do anything horrific, but I really came at him verbally. And after the interaction, and he was quickly able to save the issue, he ended up actually being able to recover my ticket and change my flight. And I got everything I wanted out of the engagement. And as I was walking to my new gate, I felt just tremendous shame. I felt shame about the way that I had talked to him. I felt shame that this little monster, it felt like, lived within me. And who is that little monster that lurks in there? And how did that come out? And I also felt embarrassed. I mean, it wasn't super public, but there were people around. And I remember him looking at me straight in my face and saying, "Sir, I work at the airport. Your words mean nothing to me." And I felt very low at that moment because he had kind of won the exchange. And the other thing that really came up for me in that moment, too, is that I really wanted to tell him I was sorry. I really wanted to tell him, and not even just make an excuse, be like, "Look, when that one got away from me, man, and I'm really sorry." And that's really important to me, to be able to acknowledge when I've been wrong about something and to make a repair. And because I was catching a flight and I was in a hurry, I couldn't make the repair. I don't know his name. It was 15 minutes of my life at best, but I can still see his face and I can still feel how I felt in that moment. And that was, in the grand scheme of your life, 15 minutes, so relatively meaningless, but it's meaningful for me in the way that I relate to conflict and how I think about myself and how I treat other people, especially strangers. And so obviously I've had way more meaningful conflicts relationally than that one, but that one keeps coming up for me. And so sometimes on the show, people tell stories like I just did, where they're kind of the villain and they had to learn something from being on the wrong end of a dispute. Sometimes we have people who tell stories where they are the victor, and maybe they were in a one-sided relationship where somebody had been taking advantage of them or bullying them, and they finally told them what time it was and stood up for themselves or set a boundary. And that's the meaningful conflict. And they learned something powerful about themselves and their ability to be brave in a moment and advocate for what they need. And then sometimes we have stories where you and I have both been in arguments where you kind of look back after 15 minutes or 15 years and think, how did we even get here? And how did this even start in the first place? And it's just kind of the fog of argumentative war. And so we tell stories of confusion and people trying to make their way in relationships amid confusing clashes as well. So in the end, it's a story about important conflicts in all of our lives and how we all relate to conflict.
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times I've had whether it's even if it's not like a really heated discussion about something, I look back, not even like 10 minutes later, I'm like, that was so stupid. Why did I do that? You know what? I might have been right, but I still handled it poorly in a way where it's like, now see, I could have said this in a much better way, even if I really thought I was right. And sometimes I might have been, sometimes I still just didn't want to admit that I was wrong. But there's so many instances where I could have said Y instead of X. And the point you made about it being, only 15 minutes of your life. I have and I think a lot of it's just anxiety, where I think about something that happened that was relatively just not meaningful in the grand scheme of things, but like it still nags at me. And I think you showed a much better balance there. You shouldn't just, outright dismiss all these experiences, but that at the same time, they shouldn't be crippling to you where they're just, you start to think, oh, that's who I am. I'm a terrible person. I think some people can get caught up in that too. It's these things, as long as they can seem small in the grand scheme of things, but if you actually do take a lesson out of it and become better, then even though it really didn't take up that much time in your life, you can still use it as a positive change for going forward. And I think what you talked about with the guy at the airport was a really good example of that. And so I think that's a good segue into this point about, we talked about earlier how we like to give practical experience to people so that's not just very abstract or philosophical. It's things that they could do now. So I always like to make sure that at least one question I have towards the end of interviews is specifically dedicated to how people can practically apply information given by the guest. So what are 2 to 3 practical pieces of advice that anybody listening right now can use to promote civility?
The first one is be a bridge builder. So how are you creating connection in conversations that are otherwise conflicting? And so what questions are you asking to inspire curiosity in the other person? What kinds of common ground are you trying to find in terms of values, in terms of beliefs about the world, or just in terms of your shared love of pickleball or whatever the thing is? And the second one is I think we should talk to more strangers. So let's build bridges when we're having conversations with one another, and let's talk to more strangers. Let's expand our social circle. Let's try to find some new, interesting, curious, unlikely connections and alliances.
I will definitely vouch for the expanding social circles. You never know who you're going to meet, and you'll find. I mean, there's going to be something you agree with. Might not be politics, might not be religion or anything like that, but you'll probably find some sort of interest that you two can agree on. Any final thoughts you'd like to share on civility and toxicity or the initiative? Anything relevant to that? Any final thoughts?
I appreciate the work you do, Paul. I mean, there's lots of good bedfellows in this space and who are promoting healthy conflict writ large, whatever that means, promoting healthy conflict, promoting bridge building, promoting talking to more strangers. And so my final thought would just be thank you for the work that you do, and I appreciate the chance to be on your show.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. And thank you for being on here, and thank you for the work that you are doing in this regard. It is nice to see. It does feel like there's at least more and more people that are getting involved in this space, or at least I have been involved in this space much longer than I have. So it's always great to find other people that are in that space, especially because there are a pretty eclectic mix of us. There's some Republicans, there's some Democrats, there's some independents, there's some third parties, there's some people that don't even, want to specify what their politics are. I try to do that as little as possible myself. So really appreciate the work you do as well. And thank you for the kind words. And speaking of the Civility Initiative, before we get to the final question, how can people contribute to the work of the Civility Initiative?
Check out our media sources, which is you can find us at When We Disagree in any podcast. You can find a PBS story that Judy Woodruff did about our work. And you can find me at the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. I'll come right up if you Google it. And then we are supported by viewers like you and by donors like you as well. And so we always appreciate people's support, whether it's with their attention or their resources.
Absolutely. I'll give you a chance to also share some links at the end, so I'll definitely put those as well. But before we get to that, I'm going to go to the final question of the podcast. So for all my guests, I like to have random questions. Rarely ever related to politics, and even if it is related to politics, it's usually something silly. But I just like to use it just to round out the podcast, give people a different side to the guest. So for you, Dr. Lee, the random question of the day is a GIF file pronounced GIF or GIF?
It's definitely GIF, and anybody who says it's GIF is fundamentally wrong. It may be deeply broken.
Yeah,
that's a great question.
Yeah, I know we talk about civility here, but boy, whenever I hear somebody say GIF, it makes me irrationally annoyed.
That's right.
How can you think that? It's a graphics interchange.
The only appropriate response to that is hostility.
Apparently the guy who created the type of file, I think he calls it a GIF. And it's like, why would you do that? Like, I don't care what. Yeah, I don't care what he says. He's wrong. It's a GIF. It's a GIF. I'm going to share a GIF. Come on now, really?
That's right.
What are we talking about? But
great question.
Yes. Okay. I'm so thankful you said that. More thankful than I probably should be. Just drives me crazy when people say.
Yeah, you've got a lot invested in this one, but I get it.
I've had other questions like that too that I've had with other people, just that I get way too. So in a way, I kind of get like to be. It's a little bit more cathartic for me there, so I don't get like it helps me not to get angry about something political. We're obviously talking about here with civility, so I kind of like to channel it at something that really actually doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, like
Right.
whether it's pronounced
Right,
GIF or
right, right.
GIF. In a way, I think that actually kind of helps with the catharsis. But Dr. Lee, thank you so much for being on here. And like I said, other things you want to promote, if you want to promote your books that you have real quick, you can do so right now.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, if anybody's curious to go to sleep to either book I've read written called "Creating Conservatism: Post-War Words That Made an American Movement" and "We Are Not People: Secession and Separatism in American Politics Since 1776."
All right, there you go. So I will definitely have those links there, as well as to the Civility Initiative and the When We Disagree podcast. My links, my Facebook, LinkedIn profile, medium.com profile, my 5-day educational email course, very relevant to this, about how to more effectively combat toxicity in politics, and my email and my website. So we are going to wrap things up here. So thank you all so much for listening. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And we will see you next time.